There is a place on this planet so hostile, so completely inhospitable, that the majority of its land has never been seen by human eyes. A continent buried under 2 miles of ice. A place where the wind alone can kill you. Where the temperature drops so low that exposed skin begins to die in minutes. Where almost nothing lives, almost nothing grows, and almost nothing ever has. Except that last part is kind of a lie. Because roughly 35 million years ago, Antarctica was one of the most alive places on the face of the Earth. And not alive in some modest, scrappy, barely surviving way. Alive in the most extravagant, absurd, terrifying sense of the word. Rainforests, rivers teeming with predators, coastlines patrolled by things that make great white sharks look like a mild inconvenience. A landscape so dense with life that if you stood in the middle of it, you would have no idea, not a single clue that you were standing on what would one day become the most desolate continent on the planet. This is the story of Antarctica before the ice came, and it is far stranger than anything you have been told. To understand what Antarctica once was, you have to understand the climate event that made it possible, and it starts with the end of the dinosaurs. When the asteroid hit 66 million years ago, it didn't just wipe out the dominant life forms on the planet. It destabilized the entire climate system. Dust and sulfur choked the atmosphere. Temperatures plummeted. The world went dark and cold. But then, slowly something shifted. The skies began to clear, and all of that carbon that had been locked away, all of that heat that had been suppressed, started releasing back into the atmosphere at a scale that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. The result was one of the warmest periods Earth has ever experienced in the last 100 million years. Scientists call it the Eocene Thermal Maximum. And in Antarctica, it produced an average temperature of around 25 degrees Celsius. That is roughly equivalent to Miami in late spring, on a continent that today averages negative 57 degrees in winter. The ice was gone, completely. In its place were swamps, palm trees, flowering plants, and dense subtropical forests stretching from the coastline inland, across terrain that today is buried under thousands of feet of frozen water. The continent had drifted south, but not yet as far south as it sits today, and the warmth of the global greenhouse more than compensated for whatever latitude it had lost. Antarctica was not just habitable, it was thriving, and into that thriving world came some of the most bizarre creatures that ever walked, swum, or stalked anything on this planet. The apex predator of ancient Antarctica did not come from Antarctica, it came from South America, crossing overland during a period when the two continents were still connected, and it reshaped every ecosystem it entered. The terror bird, standing up to 8 feet tall, weighing over 300 pounds, with a beak like a pickaxe and legs built for speed that could carry it past 30 miles per hour across open ground. This was not a bird in any sense that the word conjures in your mind. This was a pursuit predator, an ambush hunter, a killing machine that had essentially reverse engineered everything terrifying about the raptors that had gone extinct millions of years before it. And in Antarctica, it had an entire continent to itself. The mammals that shared this world with it were mostly South American in origin, strange archaic creatures that have no real modern equivalent. Rhino-like herbivores that grazed the forest edges, smaller animals that darted through the undergrowth, marsupials that had not yet made the crossing to Australia and were still finding their footing in a landscape that was nothing like the frozen wasteland their distant descendants would one day be associated with. It was a complete ecosystem, predator and prey, hunter and hunted, a fully realized world operating at full capacity in a place that the modern mind refuses to associate with anything alive at all. But the land was not where things got truly unhinged. The water was. Antarctica's ancient coastlines and rivers were patrolled by crocodilians, not small ones at that. Crocodilians estimated from fossil evidence to have reached lengths of over 23 feet, significantly larger than the biggest saltwater crocodile ever recorded in human history. They almost certainly hunted the shoreline the way modern crocodiles hunt water holes today, patient and explosive. Nothing that came close enough to the water's edge was ever completely safe. And then there were the penguins, which sounds like a relief until you understand what the penguins of this era actually were. The emperors we know today, which already stand nearly 5 feet tall and weigh close to 100 pounds, for the small version. Ancient Antarctica was home to penguin species that stood nearly 7 feet tall and weighed as much as a large male lion. They were built like torpedoes, capable of holding their breath for over 40 minutes, and they hunted in waters already occupied by things that found them interesting for entirely different reasons. Because above all of it, moving through the open ocean just off the coast were the sharks. Not one or two species, an almost exhausting variety. Goblin sharks, carpet sharks, saw sharks, and others that have no modern counterpart, and among them, 2 species belonging to the same genus as Megalodon itself, distant cousins of the largest predatory fish that ever lived, cruising the same waters as 7-foot penguins and 23-foot crocodilians in an ocean that was warm, rich, and absolutely merciless. The waters off ancient Antarctica were not an ocean, they were an arms race. And then it ended, not slowly and not gently. In geological terms, it ended almost overnight. Around 34 million years ago, the tectonic plates that had kept Antarctica loosely connected to the rest of the world finally finished pulling apart. The Drake Passage opened between Antarctica and South America. A gap appeared between Antarctica and Australia, and through those gaps, cold deep ocean water began to circulate around the continent in a continuous loop. The Antarctic Circumpolar Current blocking warm equatorial water from ever reaching the southern coast again. The temperature began to drop, the forest began to retreat, the ice began to form, first at altitude, then spreading outward, then thickening and accelerating its own cooling by reflecting solar radiation back into space before it could warm anything. It became a feedback loop with no exit. The colder it got, the more ice formed. The more ice formed, the colder it got. The animals that could leave left. The ones that couldn't adapt fast enough died where they stood. Species that had dominated this continent for tens of millions of years were erased in what amounts to a geological instant. The terror birds were gone, the giant crocodilians were gone. The ancient mammals, the bizarre plants, the subtropical coastlines, all of it buried under ice that has been accumulating, compressing, and deepening ever since. What remained was silence, and very cold, and the slow erasure of every trace that any of it had ever existed at all. But here is what should genuinely disturb you. We have barely looked. The fossils we have recovered from ancient Antarctica represent a tiny fraction of one island, Seymour Island, off the Antarctic Peninsula. That is it. The rest of the continent, an area roughly the size of the United States and Mexico combined, lies under ice sheets up to 2 miles thick. Whatever is down there has never been seen. Whatever creatures lived and died in the interior of ancient Antarctica, whatever ecosystems existed, and whatever evolutionary stories played out across tens of millions of years, all of it is still there, frozen in place, waiting under a weight of ice that we currently have no practical way of removing. We are not at the end of Antarctica's story. We are barely at the beginning of understanding it. Every fossil that has ever been recovered from this continent has come from one small corner of one small island on its outer edge, and those fossils alone have already rewritten what we thought we knew about what this place once was. The rest of it is still down there, perfectly preserved, perfectly silent, just waiting. And that might be the most remarkable thing about Antarctica. Not what we know, what we don't.